A single forged signature destroyed her life. Stripped of her inheritance and cast out by her own blood into the brutal Colorado wilderness, a disgraced heiress had to choose: freeze alone in the snow or surrender her survival to the territory's most terrifying outcast. Blood, betrayal, and a desperate bargain followed. The grand ballroom of the Linfield estate in Boston was a cage of gilded mirrors and suffocating velvet. Victoria Linfield, heiress to the largest shipping empire on the eastern seaboard, stood in the center of it all, her hands trembling beneath the silk of her evening gloves. For months, she had played the role of the perfect, obedient daughter, destined to marry Harrison Whitmore, a railway tycoon whose charm masked a chilling ruthlessness. But the ledger burning a hole in the secret pocket of her crinoline skirt was proof of Harrison's true nature, an illegal arms smuggling ring that had cost the lives of dozens of innocent settlers out west. Victoria had believed, in her naive righteousness, that the truth would save her. She had taken the ledger to her father, expecting righteous fury. Instead, she found him standing by the hearth, swirling a glass of amber bourbon alongside Harrison himself. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her father wasn't just blind to the smuggling, he was financing it. Before the night was over, Victoria's reality was systematically dismantled. There was no public scene, no shouting match. High society dealt in whispers and locked doors. Her mother, Constance, looked away as two burly men from a private sanitarium seized Victoria's arms. The narrative was spun with terrifying efficiency. The stress of the impending wedding had shattered Victoria's fragile mind. She had suffered a hysterical break, stolen family funds, and fabricated wild delusions. They gave her a choice: be locked in the violent ward of the asylum, where her spirit would be broken with ice baths and heavy sedatives, or accept permanent exile. A train ticket to the Colorado Territory, where her disgraced, estranged aunt lived in a dying silver mining camp called Georgetown. Victoria, clinging to her sanity and her life, chose the train. She arrived in Georgetown in the bitter chill of mid-November 1878. She had only 2 trunks of useless silk dresses, a velvet cloak, and exactly $50 to her name. The town was a chaotic scar on the side of the Majestic, imposing Rockies, a place of mud, saloons, and desperate men seeking fortune in the dirt. But the final, cruelest twist awaited her at the boarding house on Taos Street. Dead, the callous landlady spat, tossing Victoria's trunk onto the muddy floorboards. Fever took your aunt 3 weeks ago. House belongs to the bank now. If you ain't got the rent, you ain't got a bed. For 3 days, Victoria survived in the brutal, unfamiliar squalor of the frontier town. She traded a pearl necklace for a few nights in a drafty room above a noisy tavern, listening to the shouts of drunken miners and the harsh winter wind battering the glass. She tried to find work, offering to teach French or play the piano, but Georgetown had no use for a ruined Boston socialite. The townsfolk looked at her with a mixture of pity and predatory greed. Desperation set in. A traveling merchant told her of a convent over the mountain pass in Leadville that took in destitute women. It was a perilous journey, but remaining in Georgetown meant starvation, or worse. Paying a shady prospector her last $20 to guide her over the treacherous Loveland Pass, Victoria set out into the jagged peaks. She was betrayed before the sun even set. Halfway up the agonizing incline, as the sky turned a bruised, ominous purple, the guide drew his revolver. He took her remaining coins, her heavy winter coat, and the single trunk she had brought. "Consider it a mercy, lady," the man sneered, mounting his mule. "You wouldn't have survived the convent anyway." He left her there, wearing only a woolen dress and a light shawl, as the first violent flakes of a Colorado blizzard began to fall. The wind howled like a wounded animal, slicing through her clothes and freezing the tears on her cheeks. Victoria forced herself to walk, her leather boots slipping on the icy rocks. Every breath was a shard of glass in her lungs. The world dissolved into a blinding, disorienting white. She didn't know how long she walked, hours perhaps, or only minutes. Her limbs grew heavy, a dangerous, warm lethargy spreading through her blood. She stumbled over a buried root and fell hard into a snowbank. She couldn't feel her hands or her feet. The high society of Boston, the betrayal of her father, the cruel smirk of Harrison Whitmore, it all faded into the roaring white noise of the storm. Victoria closed her eyes, surrendering to the inevitable sleep of the freezing. But just as the darkness claimed her, a massive shadow broke through the blizzard. A terrifying figure, draped in thick wolf pelts, loomed over her. He seemed to materialize from the storm itself, a ghost of the mountain. Before she lost consciousness, she felt a pair of incredibly strong, calloused hands lift her from the snow as easily as if she were a child. Heat. Thick, suffocating heat mixed with the sharp scent of burning pine and dried herbs. Victoria gasped, her eyes snapping open. The light was dim, flickering from a stone hearth that dominated the small, rough-hewn log cabin. She was buried under a mountain of heavy furs, her ruined dress discarded somewhere out of sight, replaced by a massive coarse flannel shirt that swallowed her frame. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her thawing body. She scrambled backward, hitting the rough timber wall of the cabin, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "You'll rip the stitches if you thrash about like a frightened doe." The voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. Victoria turned her head. Sitting at a scarred wooden table, methodically cleaning a Winchester rifle, was the man who had pulled her from the snow. He was formidable. Broad-shouldered and heavily muscled, he wore buckskin trousers and a Henley shirt unbuttoned at the throat. His face was a landscape of harsh survival, a square jaw covered in a thick, dark beard, and a vicious, jagged scar that ran from his left temple down to his jawline, narrowly missing a piercing, ice-blue eye. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like the outlaws her mother used to read about in penny dreadfuls, the kind who slaughtered families in their sleep. "Where am I?" Victoria demanded, trying to project the haughty authority of a Linfield, though her voice cracked pitifully. "Who are you?" "You're in my cabin, 10 miles off the main trail, halfway up the ridge," he said, not looking up from his rifle. "And you're alive. That should be enough for you, city girl." "It is not enough. I demand to know your name." He finally looked at her. His eyes were cold, hollow things that had seen too much death. Caleb Rourke. Victoria froze. Even in the brief time she had spent in Georgetown, she had heard that name whispered in the taverns. Caleb Rourke, the mountain demon. A former Army scout who had gone feral, a man the townsfolk claimed had murdered 2 prospectors in cold blood over a gold claim and retreated to the high peaks where no sheriff dared to follow. Mothers used his name to frighten children into obedience. "You're the murderer," she whispered, pulling the furs tighter to her chest. Caleb let out a short, humorless breath, snapping the lever of the rifle closed with a sharp metallic clack. "If I were a murderer, you'd be at the bottom of the ravine, not sleeping in my bed while I spent the night in a chair. You were half dead, frostbite on your hands, a gash on your leg from a rock, and freezing from the inside out." "I have to leave," she panicked, pushing the furs aside and trying to stand. Her legs instantly gave out, buckling beneath her. Caleb was there before she hit the floor. His hands gripped her waist, hauling her back onto the mattress with effortless strength. His grip was iron, yet surprisingly careful. "You're not going anywhere. Look out the window." Victoria turned her head. The single frosted pane of glass revealed a terrifying reality. The snow was piled halfway up the window, and the blizzard was still raging with apocalyptic fury, a wall of blinding white. "You try to leave now, you'll be dead in 10 paces, Caleb stated bluntly, stepping back to give her space. "We're snowed in. Could be 3 days, could be a week before the pass is clear." Trapped. She was trapped in an isolated cabin with a man the entire territory believed was a killer. Victoria swallowed hard, forcing her racing heart to slow down. She had survived Harrison Whitmore's treacherous schemes and her family's betrayal. She refused to die crying in a pioneer's shack. "Why did you save me?" she asked, her voice steadier now. Caleb walked back to the table, picking up a tin cup of coffee. He stared into the black liquid for a long moment before answering. "I didn't go out looking for you. I was tracking an elk. Found you half buried. A man doesn't leave a dog to freeze to death, let alone a woman, no matter how foolish she is for being up here in a dress." "I was robbed," Victoria snapped, defensive anger flaring. "My guide took my coat and left me to die." Caleb's gaze flicked to her, a terrifyingly sharp assessment. He noted her posture, the refined cadence of her speech, the delicate manicured hands that were currently blistered and red from the frost. "You're running from something. People like you don't end up in Georgetown without a reason. And they sure as hell don't try to cross Loveland Pass in November unless they got the devil on their heels. My circumstances are none of your concern, Mr. Rourke. They are when you're eating my rations," he countered smoothly. For the next 3 days, a tense, volatile truce settled over the cabin. The blizzard showed no signs of stopping. Victoria was forced to adapt to a life stripped of all pretense. She learned that Caleb, despite his frightening exterior, possessed a rigid, almost silent code of honor. He never touched her, never crossed the invisible line drawn between his side of the room and the bed he had surrendered to her. As her strength returned, so did her defiance. She insisted on helping, dragging herself out of bed to stir the stew or mend a tear in his coat with her clumsy, frost-bitten fingers. She watched him. He was a man of intense discipline. He moved with a quiet lethality, yet he handled the injured wing of a snowbird he had found on the porch with startling gentleness. One evening, as the wind screamed against the roof, Victoria broke the heavy silence. "They say you killed 2 men in town." Caleb paused, his knife suspended over a block of wood he was whittling. The firelight caught the vicious scar on his face, making him look demonic. "People say a lot of things." "Is it true?" she pressed, her heart pounding in her throat. He slowly set the knife down and looked at her. They were men who made a living beating women in the alley behind the Silver Nugget Saloon. The law wouldn't touch them because they bribed the deputies. I caught them dragging a young girl into the stables. I gave them a choice to walk away. They drew their guns. I drew faster. He leaned forward, the intensity in his eyes pinning her in place. "I didn't murder them, Miss Linfield. I put them down. But townfolk don't like a man who takes the law into his own hands, especially an outsider, so they branded me a monster." Victoria stared at him, the walls of her own prejudices cracking. She thought of Harrison Whitmore, a monster draped in expensive wool suits, hailed by society as a gentleman. And here was Caleb Rourke, a man branded a beast by society, who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return. "I know what it's like," Victoria whispered, the bitter truth slipping out before she could stop it. "To have the world decide what you are, and punish you for a truth they refuse to hear." For the first time, the hardened, cynical mask on Caleb's face slipped. He looked at the ruined heiress sitting by his fire, truly seeing her. In the isolation of the frozen Rockies, 2 outcasts had just recognized the same scars in each other. The relentless howling of the wind finally ceased on the morning of the 5th day. Victoria awoke not to the terrifying rattle of the window panes, but to a profound, ringing silence that felt heavier than the storm itself. She pushed the heavy bear and wolf pelts aside, her breath pluming in the frigid air of the cabin. Caleb was already awake, standing by the hearth, stoking the dying embers into a crackling blaze. The golden light of the morning sun pierced the frosted window, casting long, stark shadows across the rough-hewn floorboards. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a pristine, untouched world of blinding white. "The pass will be buried under 10 feet of drift," Caleb said, his deep voice slicing through the quiet. He didn't turn around, his broad back shifting as he hauled a heavy cast-iron pot over the flames. "It'll take days for the sun to pack it down enough to walk on. You're stuck here a while longer, Miss Linfield." Victoria wrapped her woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders, the biting cold of the cabin floor seeping through her thick stockings. "I suppose there are worse fates than being stranded with the terror of Georgetown." A low, rumbling chuckle vibrated from Caleb's chest. It was a surprising sound, rich and warm, entirely at odds with his fearsome reputation. "Careful, you might ruin my good name." Over the next week, the forced proximity stripped away the final remnants of Victoria's aristocratic veneer. The Boston heiress who had never laced her own boots learned the brutal, unforgiving rhythm of mountain survival. Caleb proved to be a harsh but patient teacher. He showed her how to skin a snowshoe hare without ruining the meat, how to pack snow against the cabin's foundation for insulation, and how to read the sky for incoming squalls. She, in turn, offered him the only thing she had left, her intellect. In the evenings, sitting by the fire, she recounted the sprawling histories she had read in her father's library. She spoke of European empires and ancient philosophies, her voice filling the small, isolated space. Caleb listened with intense focus, his icy blue eyes reflecting the dancing flames, revealing a sharp, hungry intelligence that formal schooling had never touched. The invisible barrier between them began to dissolve, replaced by a silent, mutual respect. Victoria found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the precise, economical way he moved, the flex of muscles beneath his buckskin shirt, the quiet melancholy that seemed to anchor his soul. He was a man shaped by violence, yet capable of profound gentleness. One evening, as Caleb was sharpening his skinning knife, Victoria finally spoke the truth that had brought her to the edge of the world. "Harrison Whitmore," she began, her voice trembling slightly. Caleb stopped his rhythmic grinding of the blade against the whetstone, giving her his full attention. "He is the man I was supposed to marry. He built his fortune on railroads, or so society believed. But I found his ledgers. He was diverting shipments of stolen Springfield Model 1,873 rifles from the federal armories and selling them to renegade factions and ruthless land barons out west. He was profiting from massacres." Caleb's jaw tightened, the scar on his face pulling taut. As a former scout, he knew exactly what illicit repeating rifles did to the fragile peace of the territories. It meant slaughtered homesteads and bloody skirmishes. "I took the proof to my father," Victoria continued, a bitter tear escaping her eye. "My own father, a man of standing, a philanthropist, and I learned he was taking a 30% cut of the smuggling ring. When they realized I knew, they had 2 men from the asylum drag me away. They told everyone I was hysterical, mad. They gave me a choice: rot in a padded cell or disappear into the mountains." Caleb slowly set the knife and whetstone on the table. He stood up, crossing the small distance between them, and knelt before her chair. He was so close, she could smell the scent of wood smoke, pine, and leather that clung to him. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping the tear from her cheek. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her heart. "You are the bravest woman I have ever met, Victoria," he murmured, his voice a gravelly whisper. It was the first time he had used her given name. Before the moment could deepen, a sharp, unnatural crack echoed from the valley below. Caleb was on his feet in a fraction of a second, the tenderness vanishing, replaced by the lethal predator the territory feared. He snatched his Winchester from the wall, his eyes narrowing as he moved to the window, keeping his body pressed against the logs. "What was that?" Victoria whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Rifle fire," echoed off the granite ridge, Caleb said, his gaze sweeping the tree line. "Too heavy to be a hunter's carbine. That was a Sharp's buffalo rifle, and nobody hunts buffalo in 3 feet of snow on a 40-degree incline." He turned to her, his expression grim. "They aren't hunting animals, Victoria. They're hunting men. Or women. Panic seized her. Harrison. He wouldn't just let me go. He knows I have the ledger. You brought the ledger? Caleb demanded, his eyes flashing. It's sewn into the lining of my corset, she confessed. It was the only way to keep it safe. If he realizes I took it, he won't stop until I'm dead. Caleb began stuffing ammunition into his pockets and tossing supplies into a canvas sack. Get your coat. Wrap your feet in the extra pelts. We have less than an hour. Where are we going? Higher, Caleb replied, tossing her a heavy woolen scarf. Into the crags. If they tracked you from Georgetown, they know about this cabin. We can't hold them off here, not if they have a sharps. They'll punch holes right through these timber walls. As they stepped out into the blinding, freezing expanse, Victoria looked back at the small cabin that had become her sanctuary. The harsh reality of her life had caught up to her. The high society of Boston had sent its executioners, and now her only shield was the mountain's most dangerous outcast. The ascent was a grueling, agonizing test of endurance. The snow was waist-deep in places, and the air grew dangerously thin the higher they climbed into the jagged spine of the Rockies. Caleb broke the trail, using his massive frame to plow through the drifts, leaving a trench for Victoria to follow. Her lungs burned with every breath, tasting of blood and frost. But terror fueled her trembling legs. Below them, the distant, unmistakable sound of horses struggling through the snow echoed up the canyon. They were closing in. "Keep moving," Caleb ordered, his voice tight with exertion. He paused only to scan the tree line below through a brass spyglass. 3 men, heavily armed. One of them is wearing a bowler hat, a city man. The other 2 are hired guns, locals by the look of their coats. The city man. It must be Josiah Reed, Victoria gasped, clutching her side as they scrambled up a treacherous, icy slope. Harrison's fixer. He's an ex-Pinkerton. He makes people disappear. He's out of his element up here, Caleb grunted, pulling her up over a massive boulder that offered a temporary reprieve from the wind. But the local boys know how to track. We need to reach the old silver mine at the summit. It's an abandoned shaft, but it has a defensible choke point. They reached the mouth of the mine just as the sun began its descent, painting the snow-capped peaks in violent streaks of crimson and bruised purple. The entrance was a dark, jagged maw carved into the solid granite. Inside, it smelled of stale air, damp earth, and ancient decay. Caleb ushered her deep into the tunnel, behind a rusted, overturned ore cart. "Stay down," he commanded, handing her a heavy, single-action Colt revolver. "Thumb the hammer back, aim for the center of mass, and pull the trigger. Don't hesitate." Victoria took the heavy weapon, her hands shaking violently. She had never fired a gun in her life. She was a woman taught to pour tea and arrange peonies, not wage war in a lightless cave. "Caleb, I won't let them take you, Victoria," he said, his eyes burning with a fierce, protective light in the gloom. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, pulling her forehead against his. It was a raw, desperate gesture of solidarity. "I swear it on my life." He moved to the entrance, melting into the shadows behind a stack of rotting timber reinforcements, his Winchester raised and ready. The silence stretched, agonizing and thick. The only sound was the drip of melting ice deeper in the shaft and Victoria's ragged breathing. Then, the crunch of boots on snow. "End of the line, Miss Linfield," a voice called out, echoing off the canyon walls. It was sharp, cultured, and dripping with malicious confidence. "Josiah Reed, we know you're in there. Your little mountain savage can't protect you from a dozen bullets." Caleb remained silent, his breathing perfectly controlled. "Your father sends his regards, Victoria," Reed shouted, his voice moving closer. He told Mr. Whitmore it was a tragic necessity, a father's heartbreak, having a daughter succumb to the elements after escaping her confinement. Very tragic, but very clean. Tears pricked Victoria's eyes, the final, agonizing confirmation of her father's utter betrayal sinking into her bones. He hadn't just exiled her, he had signed her death warrant to protect his wealth. "Flush them out," Reed barked. Two men rushed the entrance. Caleb didn't hesitate. The Winchester roared, a deafening explosion of sound and muzzle flash that lit the tunnel in strobe-like bursts. The first hired gun took a round directly to the chest, spinning backward into the snow with a choked cry. The second man fired wildly into the dark, his bullets splintering the timbers above Caleb's head, showering him in deadly wood shards. Caleb levered another round with blinding speed and fired. The second man dropped his rifle, clutching his shattered shoulder, and scrambled away out of sight, screaming in agony. "Damn you!" Reed shrieked from cover. A second later, the booming roar of the Sharp's buffalo rifle shattered the air. A massive, heavy-caliber bullet smashed through the rotting timber barricade, missing Caleb's head by inches and embedding itself deep in the rock wall behind him with a shower of granite shrapnel. Caleb ducked low, his face bleeding from a rock splinter. "They have us pinned. If he keeps firing that Sharps, he'll bring the tunnel roof down on us." Victoria looked at the heavy Colt in her hands. She thought of her father standing by the fire, drinking bourbon while he sold her soul. She thought of Harrison Whitmore's smug, untouchable smile. And she looked at Caleb, bleeding in the dirt to protect a woman he owed absolutely nothing to. The terror evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing fury. She wasn't a victim anymore. "Cover me," Victoria said, her voice dropping an octave, devoid of its former aristocratic tremble. Caleb stared at her. "What are you doing? Stay down." Ignoring him, Victoria crawled to the edge of the overturned ore cart. She could see Josiah Reed's shadow cast against the snow, kneeling behind a boulder, reloading the massive single-shot Sharps. He was focused entirely on Caleb's position, ignoring the dark corner where she crouched. She braced the heavy barrel of the Colt on the edge of the iron cart. She thumbed back the hammer just as Caleb had told her. She aimed for the shadow, her finger tightening on the trigger. Crack. The recoil threw her backward, her wrist screaming in pain. The bullet struck the boulder inches from Reed's face, sending a deadly spray of rock shards into his eyes. Reed screamed, dropping the buffalo rifle and clutching his face, stumbling blindly backward into the deep snow. Caleb didn't miss the opportunity. He broke from cover, a terrifying phantom of vengeance. He crossed the distance in 3 massive strides, tackling the blinded Pinkerton man to the ground. A brief, brutal struggle ensued in the snow, ending when Caleb brought the heavy brass stock of his Winchester down hard against Reed's temple. The man went limp. Silence rushed back into the canyon, broken only by the whistling wind. Caleb stood slowly, chest heaving, his blue eyes locking onto the dark entrance of the mine. Victoria emerged from the shadows, her face pale, the smoking revolver still clutched tightly in her hand. Caleb walked toward her, stepping over the fallen men. When he reached her, he took the gun from her trembling grip and tossed it aside. Without a word, he pulled her against his chest. Victoria buried her face in his buckskin coat, inhaling the scent of gun smoke and snow, her arms wrapping fiercely around his waist. "It's over," Caleb whispered into her hair, his massive hands holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "They're done." They stood together on the edge of the mountain summit, 2 outcasts forged in fire and ice, finally finding their anchor in the storm. Josiah Reed groaned as Caleb bound his wrists with thick rawhide, tying him securely to the heavy iron wheel of the overturned ore cart. The Pinkerton fixer's face was a bloody, mangled ruin. The 2 surviving hired guns had already fled down the treacherous slope, leaving a trail of crimson in the snow. "They'll make for Georgetown," Caleb muttered, his breath pluming in the freezing air as he scavenged the dropped buffalo rifle. "But Reed stays here. When the sheriff finally braves the pass, he can collect him." "We are taking his horse." Victoria nodded, her hands trembling from the adrenaline still surging through her veins. She turned her back to the biting wind, unbuttoning the ruined bodice of her borrowed dress. With Caleb's hunting knife, she sliced through the heavy silk of her corset. From the secret lining, she pulled a small leather-bound ledger. It was worn, stained with melting snow, but the ink inside the damning records of Harrison Whitmore's treason and her father's complicity remained intact. "We need a federal marshal," Victoria said, her voice steady as she held the book up to the fading light. "Georgetown's law is bought and paid for. We must ride for Denver City, U.S. District Judge Moses Hallett holds court there. He is a man the syndicates haven't managed to bribe." Caleb looked at the delicate heiress, marveling at the steel forged within her over the past 2 weeks. Denver is a hornet's nest. If Whitmore realizes Reed failed, he won't just send hired guns. He'll buy half the city's police force. "Then we will have to move faster than his money," she replied, her chin tilted in defiance. The descent was brutal, but with Reed's thoroughbred to share, they made it to the foothills by dawn. Bypassing the corrupted deputies of Georgetown, they rode hard through the winding canyons toward the sprawling, smoke-choked skyline of Denver City. The transition from the pristine wilderness to the booming metropolis was jarring. Denver in 1878 was a chaotic collision of wealth and frontier violence. Caleb, draped in wolf pelts and carrying 3 rifles, drew terrified stares on Larimer Street. Victoria, wearing a rough woolen blanket over her tattered clothes, looked like a beggar, but she walked with the regal, unyielding posture of an empress returning to claim her throne. They did not go to the courthouse. Victoria knew exactly how men of wealth operated. "The Windsor Hotel," Victoria instructed, pointing toward the lavish brick building that dominated the street corner. If Harrison traveled west to oversee this final shipment of rifles, he wouldn't dare sleep anywhere else. He requires luxury like he requires air. Caleb's jaw tightened. He chambered a round into his Winchester, the metallic clack turning the heads of pedestrians. "Stay behind me." They pushed through the ornate brass doors of the Windsor Hotel, stepping onto crimson Turkish carpets. The lobby was a symphony of clinking crystal, cigar smoke, and hushed negotiations. And there, sitting in the center of the lavish dining room beneath a glittering chandelier, was Harrison Whitmore. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, laughing smoothly as he poured champagne for 2 men wearing the insignia of the state militia. Victoria didn't hesitate. She marched past the gaping maitre d', Caleb flanking her like an avenging shadow. The heavy thud of Caleb's snow-caked boots against the polished floorboards silenced the room. Whitmore looked up, his polite smile freezing into a mask of pure shock. He blinked, clearly believing he was looking at a ghost. "Hello, Harrison," Victoria said, her voice slicing through the dead silence of the dining room. "Victoria?" Whitmore breathed. Standing up so fast his chair clattered to the floor. His eyes darted to the terrifying mountain man beside her, then back to her ruined clothes. "Good. We thought you were dead. Your father. The sanitarium." "Save the performance," Victoria snapped. She threw the leather-bound ledger directly onto his plate of roasted pheasant. It landed with a heavy, wet slap, overturning his crystal goblet. "I believe you lost this in Boston." Whitmore's face drained of all color as he recognized the book. The militia officers at the table shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sudden lethal tension. "This woman is a madwoman," Whitmore suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He gestured frantically to the hotel security guards rushing into the room. "She is an escaped lunatic from Massachusetts. Arrest her. Arrest them both." 2 guards reached for their billy clubs, but Caleb moved with terrifying speed. He grabbed a heavy mahogany chair and slammed it into the floor, splintering the legs and holding the jagged backrest like a weapon. His ice-blue eyes swept the room, freezing the guards in their tracks. Before the standoff could erupt into a bloodbath, the heavy double doors of the dining room swung open. A stern, gray-bearded man, in a dark frock coat, stepped through, flanked by 4 federal marshals with shotguns leveled. It was Judge Moses Hallett. Victoria had sent a telegram from a station just outside the city limits, detailing the smuggling ring and promising the ledger. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Hallett said, stepping forward and picking up the stained ledger from the table. He opened it, his eyes scanning the meticulous, damning columns of stolen federal arms and blood money. "I received a very interesting wire this morning, and it appears the evidence is as compelling as promised." Whitmore, realizing his empire was crumbling, made a fatal mistake. Desperation overriding his cunning, he lunged across the table, his hand reaching for the silver-plated derringer hidden in his waistcoat pocket. He never even touched the grip. Caleb vaulted the table, his massive hand closing around Whitmore's throat. He slammed the tycoon backward, pinning him to the ornate wallpaper. Whitmore gasped, his feet kicking uselessly above the floor as Caleb held him suspended. "Give me the word, Victoria," Caleb whispered. "Drop him," she said softly. "He belongs to the hangman now." Caleb released his grip. The marshals immediately hauled Whitmore up in irons. A week later, warrants were issued in Boston for Victoria's father. Her inheritance, entirely untainted by the smuggling ring, was restored to her name by federal decree. She was once again one of the wealthiest women in the country. She stood on the wooden platform of the Denver train station, holding a first-class ticket back to Massachusetts. Beside her stood Caleb. He had refused her money, longing for the quiet solitude of the jagged peaks. "So," Caleb said, his voice rough, "the heiress goes home." Victoria looked at the train ticket. She thought of the gilded cages of Boston, then looked at the towering, scarred mountain man who had fought through hell to keep her breathing. Slowly, Victoria tore the ticket into pieces, letting the wind scatter the paper. "Boston is a graveyard, Mr. Rourke." Victoria smiled. "I hear the air is much better halfway up the ridge." Caleb's stoic expression broke into a rare smile. He pulled her into his arms, and the beast of the Rockies carried his bride back to the mountains. What a journey! From the treacherous ballrooms of Boston to the unforgiving frozen peaks of the Colorado Rockies, Victoria proved that true strength isn't measured in wealth, but in the will to survive. She lost a gilded cage, but found genuine freedom and a fierce love in Caleb Rourke. If you loved this Wild West tale of betrayal, survival, and unexpected romance, please hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible historical dramas.
Hi, my name is Ensley Rowland, the owner and manager of Air Encounters. After watching the video, Banished from High Society, she found refuge in the arms of a feared mountain man. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was how quickly the world around her changed once she lost her place in high society. The people who once accepted her disappeared, but the one man everyone feared ended up being the person who treated her with the most honesty and care. I think that contrast is what gave the story such a strong emotional pull. I also liked how the story reminded us that true character has very little to do with wealth, reputation, or social status. Sometimes the safest and kindest people are the ones others misunderstand the most. In everyday life, I think it's important to look beyond appearances and give people the chance to show who they really are. Do you think she found real peace for the first time with the mountain man? And what moment in the story stayed with you the longest? Thanks for spending time with Air Encounters. If this story meant something to you, feel free to leave a comment and maybe like or subscribe for more stories like this.
Hi, my name is Robert Bowen, the owner and manager of Rugged Heart Man. After watching the video, Banished from High Society, she found refuge in the arms of a feared mountain man, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the idea that people are often judged by appearances, reputation, or where they come from. Sometimes the people we're told to fear end up showing the greatest kindness, while the places we think we belong may not offer the acceptance we need. It's a reminder that understanding someone's character takes more than a quick first impression. Have you ever been surprised by someone who turned out to be very different from what others said about them? And if you were in her position, do you think you would have had the courage to leave a familiar life behind and start over somewhere new? Maybe one lesson we can take into our own lives is to be a little slower to judge and a little more willing to see the person behind the label. If this story meant something to you, feel free to leave a comment. And if you enjoy these kinds of stories, you're always welcome to like the video or subscribe for more.